then you will find that there's a big debate on that, but you will actually find that the most recent paper on this is by Patrick Bolton and Kaspercic, two big finance professors at the Imperial College London. And they've actually shown, and it's a very influential paper, that if you say like a company like Shell or a steel company, then you will find that there's a big debate on that, but you will actually find that the most recent paper on this by Patrick Bolton and Kaspercic. I'm hearing an echo. This is at the Imperial College London. And they've actually shown, and it's a very influential paper, that if you say like a company like Shell or a steel company, you will find that there's a big debate on it. You will actually find it. Okay, I can carry on talking. So what you will find is that institutional investors and other investors will ask companies which are very carbon intensive, like steel companies or oil companies or gas companies or companies that rely a lot on fossil fuel. They said, we're only going to hold your assets in our portfolio if you give us much higher rates of return. And there's been estimated like a couple of percentage points, and over 10 or 12 years, that can accumulate to a large amount. And that's a compensation. They're demanding a compensation for this policy transition risk. So they're scared stiff that these shares are dodgy shares, carbon intensive shares, that they're dodgy, and that when suddenly there is a breakthrough in green renewable technology, or when there's suddenly lots of countries are becoming very ambitious in their climate policies, that they get stuck with holding the wrong assets, with all these fossil fuel assets. They get stuck with the risk of stranded assets. So that's the reason why in the financial markets, you actually see that those companies will have to pay higher rates of return for investors to willingly hold those risky assets. And that evidence has been really shown to be, particularly strong since 2015. Of course, you hear many other people, green people, they say, no, it's green investment. They get a higher rate of return. We should invest in it. Actually, the evidence doesn't bear that out. The evidence bears out that you have to pay higher rates of return to compensate the investors for the riskiness. And I think if you think about it, that also makes sense. So that's what's going on. So it's risky stuff. But so what do governments do? The first part of your question. So you have your steel company or you have your cement company. You don't want them to go abroad, but they have to go to net zero. So that means that if you have a steel company, they produce steel. It takes a huge amount of energy because you have to melt it at extremely high temperatures. So it's obviously going to emit a lot of CO2. So net zero means that two things. You have to make sure that the energy you use is solar energy or wind energy, is green energy. And secondly, if there is some CO2, if you still use some fossil fuel, if you can't do it all with solar or wind energy, you have to put that stuff in the ground. So what these companies are kind of basically leaning backwards. And they say to the company, well, if you really want that so much, you have to give us money to kind of find technologies to bury the CO2 and maybe in the ocean floor. That's what I'm saying. Or you have to pay us money to develop hydrogen networks. So the problem with solar and wind energy is that they are intermittent. So the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And indeed, that's why we now have an energy crisis with sky-high gas prices. So the normal thing to do is to store it. So in Norway, you can store it by pumping up water up a mountain. Then you have an abundance of solar or wind energy. And then when there is not enough energy, then you let the water crash down the mountain and you make electricity out of it. So, but that you can't do that in every country. So what people then think is you make hydrogen. So every schoolboy and girl, remember they were 14 or 15, have done something like in chemistry lessons, this thing called electrolysis. I'm not pronouncing it correctly. So this is really what it is. It's a very basic technology. And so if you look at the plans of the Green Deal for Europe, but also maybe in Britain and in many individual countries, the government is spending too much money, in my view. They're spending huge amounts, billions of money, to get the, not for newcomers, for new green companies, but for the old dirty companies, to get them to be relatively clean. It's not clear that that is the best policy to get a green transition. It will get a green transition, but maybe in a very expensive way. And I think the reason is something we haven't talked about, is that, I mean, there are two political distortions, a political and a psychological distortion. The political distortion is saying, as a former politician, you don't want to do unpopular things. So if you carbon pricing, you don't like, you want to kind of leave that for your successor. But subsidies, you like, it makes you popular. So you like to give subsidies as a politician, but you don't like to price carbon. That's the first thing. And secondly, it's a bit, remember, and there's the weather. And then the weatherman or the weatherwoman, she says, well, it's 5 degrees outside, but you feel as like the skin temperature is -8. So the wind or whatever, it feels much colder. And in a sense, these carbon taxes have a heightened salience. So you might have a carbon tax of 80 pounds per ton of CO2, but it may feel to people like 200 pounds per ton of CO2. So there is a kind of behavioral aberration. This is for anybody who studied behavioral economics, this is quite normal. But if you have those behavioral aberrations, then a kind of a second best policy, which takes account of it, would be to have not much lower carbon prices and probably fossil fuel subsidies. Remember that the planet, 7% of world GDP is subsidies for fossil fuel. So we're starting from a situation that we don't have carbon pricing, we have huge subsidies for fossil fuel. That's the weird thing. And then another distortion you get from this heightened salience and from this procrastination of politicians, that rather than giving carbon pricing, they'd rather give these huge subsidies to turn around dirty industries in the hope of making them green. So they become more susceptible to those lobbies. So there's the procrastination of politicians, understandable because it's short-term re-election considerations. And it's the psychological feature of heightened salience of carbon pricing that leads to these biases in policies. There's too little carbon, this is what we started off with, that's why we have too little carbon pricing and maybe too much subsidies, which are way, way, way much higher than would be justified by production externalities.
Okay, thank you. Still returning maybe a bit to the point about transition risks, because you mentioned that it's clear that since 2015, the risk of stranded assets is being priced in and investors demand higher returns on companies who are more exposed to it, be it in equity markets or in debt markets as well. And however, although we know that it's being priced in, it's hard to decide how accurately it is being priced in. Do you think people correctly perceive the risk? And if not, is there anything for the state or the government to do to incentivize better measures of actually deciding what the risk is? And there's been a suggestion made at some point by Mark Carney that this process should be led by the private sector. So there should be self-discipline within the industry to systemically measure the risk.
So you're right. So the private industry, so the City of London, for example, but also central banks are much more aware of this risk, and financial regulators, and the private sector, much more than the fiscal authorities, like governments and ministers. So it was, of course, Mark Carney who put this item on the agenda, and also Madame Lagarde, who now runs the ECB, and before that the IMF. So they are very well aware of it. So a lot of the private sector is now having a shadow bookkeeping, where they actually use internal carbon prices, but they don't want to do risky investments. So they want to be, even when the carbon isn't priced, they want it to be still profitable if carbon were priced properly. So the private sector is only reacting to it. There's a big demand from their shareholders to do exactly that. So yeah, and then of course on the financial regulator side, in combination with those industries, there's an enormous amount of climate stress testing. So imagine that that temperature goes up to 2 degrees or even 3 degrees. Which investments will have to be written off? Which companies will stay standing up and which ones will go belly up? So there's a huge amount of effort now with central banks in combination with private firms to look at the resilience of the financial system, because people are very worried that maybe some that you get another financial crisis, but where the cause maybe that you may get some stranded assets in some like steel companies or some other fossil fuel dependent sectors of the economy, and then it may tip over to the banking sector, and then before you know it spreads. So it propagates and amplifies, just like you would have it in the financial crisis around 2008.
Okay, and now moving off to the final sort of policy point around the toolkit that the governments have, and the issue of the flywheel effects that you mentioned quite a few times. Do you see any policies in particular that can help in reaching the technological tipping points, or social tipping points, or policy tipping points?
Well, I think it helps to have demonstration projects. So, say if I were a politician, I would probably pay money for pilot projects for communities, parts of cities, to kind of go off the gas, go off the coal, and to prove that it can be done. Of course, those first projects will be very expensive. Then to prove to other municipalities that it's actually possible. So then the idea is that another one will try it, and another one will try it, and that gradually you can lower the amount of subsidy to get this flywheel effect going, and you can take it off. So the whole idea of a flywheel effect is that you have, by demonstration projects, or just to start going, by as a launching customer, and you can do that as well for a government, it's a temporary policy, because once you switch to the other equilibrium, you can take those policies away, but then the other equilibrium will be self-sustaining. You'll get stuck in the good equilibrium rather than stuck in the bad equilibrium. So you're looking for temporary policies that give a kind of a big push, and the big push is that you really do some pilot projects, hope that it works, and hope that they learn, and hope that the costs come down, and then the second and third pilot projects, you can reduce the money all the time as you go along. But eventually you get the flywheel effect in motion, and then eventually you can take your policies and your money away from it. So yes, I do think, like the number of economists, like Mariana Asumata from University College London, that we are looking for cooperation between the private sector and governments. So maybe on this point, also on the technology side, the flywheel effect, we can learn from the vaccines. So within 1 year, we had a number of vaccines, and basically it was a race, wasn't it? So the governments are huge launching customers, and they say, look, we want to have this very quick as possible. And they set up a competition between 10, 12 of these enterprises, and they say, you go race for it. And then they took a big share into it, and it was a huge combination of the pharmaceutical industry and governments. On their own, none of them would have been possible. The government would not have been able to do it on their own, and neither would the pharmaceutical companies. And I think we need something similar for green technology. So we know what to do, but we need to have this big push to really get the green technology to work. We already know that solar and wind are maybe 2 or 3 cents per kilowatt hour, so they're actually on a par with gas and oil. But of course they're not so good because they're intermittent. So we really need a lot of technological progress on the batteries, the hydrogen, on the storage. So for that, I would say that, and you would also do some very highly risky things like fusion energy, which is a pie in the sky. But there are interesting examples of that, like the Tomahawk initiative. I think it's just outside Oxford, where Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and all these guys have invested in it. But you see that, so if that really becomes profitable, problem solved. So you need to take some really big risks with lots of governments together, the private industry together, and try to crack this problem. We don't have much time. People think we have lots of time. We don't have time. So the IPCC, so the International Panel for Climate Change, is already counting on a lot of technologies to be developed, which are not here yet. I mean, even a simple schoolboy technology like hydrogen as storage, it takes another 10 years or so before you can put it into operation. And we need to learn and get it cheaper and cheaper. Just what we've learned with solar panels and wind energy, they've become incredibly much cheaper over the last 20, 30 years just by using it. So we need to set such flywheel motions in operation as well. And then you have to honor movements in society. Maybe people like Greta Thunberg and things like that. And maybe even in Holland, we would subsidize those people. We would subsidize the critics of the government in order to generate flywheel effects. Maybe not subsidizing, but you want to facilitate them. You want to give them more room in order that they can get enough people in operation. If you just leave to the government alone, it's never going to happen. And I think that's basically the main lesson which we've learned.
Okay, thank you. Before we proceed to the more general questions regarding climate policy, I'd like to address our viewers and ask them kindly to direct questions for our Facebook page, as we've experienced some technical difficulties and cannot enable chat on this particular YouTube stream right now. We have received some questions already, but before we proceed, more general questions, question regarding green paradox and the reverse green paradox. Both of these terms are often being mentioned. Do you think they are important from a practical perspective? Do they play a role? How much should we worry, and which of the phenomena outweigh the other?
So maybe explain the green paradox first. So the idea is that if you, I'll explain with an example. I was in Algeria, and then the Minister of Finance, I said, look, if people delay with carbon pricing, if they procrastinate, and then he said, oh well, that's great. So that means we should pump a bit more before they get their act together. So then these oil producing and gas producing countries, they say if they think that politicians are procrastinating, but eventually they will take action to kind of hit this 1.5 to 2 degrees. Then of course, fossil fuel producers, they said, make hay while the sun shines. So they're going to pump up gas more vigorously and also oil more vigorously. And that will accelerate global warming. So that's the green paradox effect. So in the short run, you get more global warming. Yeah, so that's just a cost. So that just makes the cost of delay a big insight. The big part of my work is to show that if every year you wait, everything becomes more expensive. And one of the reasons it becomes more expensive is that you get an acceleration of global warming. So you have to take even more vigorous action to compensate that horrible green paradox effects. So, and there are other reasons that if you wait and delay, you're not spreading things, you're not smoothing things out properly, so that will be expensive as well. So from a welfare point of view, it's very expensive. It's exactly, again, like the vaccines. So every week you wait, or every month you wait, you let the pandemic rage on, and it's even more difficult to get the ghost back into the bottle. And that's similar here as well. So these green paradox effects, if possible, one should avoid them, because it just makes the whole thing much more costly. Because if you're a politician, you may not care about it, because the cost may fall on your successors. If Boris Johnson is gone, he says, I don't care. It's the next prime minister. It's not my problem.
Okay, now moving on to the questions from the audience. The one question that we have received is that it has been said that the transition to green technology will lead to an increase in costs and therefore cost push inflation. Do you agree with this assessment?
Well, it will definitely lead to an increase, a change in relative prices. So you will get it will be costly. I think we should be honest about it. So you can't have a green transition for free. But then of course, the advantage of the green transition now is that in the future, maybe 50 years from now, you have less temperature increases and you have less damages to the economy. maybe the GDP in 50 years from now will not be 10% lower than if we let global warming rage on. So yes, so there are costs today, but you have savings in the future. So that's why I argued in the beginning that there should be intergenerational transfers from those guys in the future to guys here today by running up government debt. So, but yes, it will be costly maybe to take a house off the gas and have heat pumps. May cost anything now, maybe 30,000 quid, 30,000 pounds. If you're a poor family, that's a lot of money. If you're a middle-class family, you want to be seen to be green, you put your solar panels on the roof, you get your heat pump, and you get an extra mortgage for an extra 50,000 pounds. So you think, well, maybe it's not too bad. But of course, for most people in society, who don't have such a high income, it's not going to happen. So they either need subsidies from the government for it, or governments need. I mean, England has a very bad tradition for social housing. I mean, the council housing in England is the national disgrace. That the poor people in Britain, they live in much worse circumstances than say in Germany or Scandinavia. But one of the things you do if you're responsible for council housing is that you make those green when you build them. That's at least the thing you do. But I think we haven't even started on that agenda yet. And yet, if you don't do it, you build more houses eventually, and then it's too late. If you then have to make them green afterwards, it's much more expensive. So it's much better to make houses green from at the start when you start building the houses. It has to do with proper insulation. It has to do with the solar roof panels, which are getting better and better all the time. And it has to do with heat pumps. Yeah. And the same thing for transport. If you, again, if you're rich, you might get one of these fancy cars. Like an electric car, Lexus, you might, and it actually gives you a little bit of extra status, maybe even. But if you're poor, you have to get out of your dirty old car into a green car. It might cost you an extra 5,000 to 10,000 pounds. If you don't have it, you can't afford it. So there is a big issue there. It will be costly, and we cannot. So without a plan for that, how to deal that it's seen to be attractive for all people in society, it's going to be seen to be as an elitist thing to do. To green it, so you should implement green policies in such a way that we get a green transition, but that it seems to be that all members of society feel that they benefit from it, and that discussion is not even part of the government discussion. So if I look at the plans coming out of number 10 if there are any plans whatsoever, but they definitely don't look at that particular part of the issue, and it is absolutely crucial. It was also a weakness of the Green Plan for Frans Timmermans of the European Commission, that climate justice, or how can you do it in such a way that the poorest members of society feel that it's also something for them in it, and not just for the rich and the better off people, as an absolutely crucial part. So this requires strong politicians with radical plans. It can lead, so to come to the question, if you, of course, so you get cost push inflation, very right, and that might lead to inflation. So in the, of course, we have a need not be, so with an appropriate monetary response, that inflationary tendency should be able to be killed off. But if you don't, then it can lead to inflation, and then and the shit hits the fan.
Okay, considering another more practical issue relating to the spatial needs, it is said that there's some densely populated countries, small countries like Netherlands, might struggle to actually accommodate for the expansion of renewable energy sector because it is less efficient in terms of space that it requires than, say, nuclear or coal energy. Should these considerations somehow affect the decisions of individual countries?
This is an absolutely crucial point. It's an essential part of Bill Gates's book. Bill Gates wrote a book on this, and he spent it. But it's true that per unit of energy, if you use solar panel or wind energy, you have a much bigger demand for space. But space has to compete for housing, it has to compete for green national parks, it has to compete for factories, and then it has to compete for these renewable energies. So the way to do, so England thinks, we put it all in the sea. Well, that's not free either. I mean, I'm a sailor. We think of the birds. There are costs to having all these windmills in the sea that we haven't. They're not clear yet, but there are costs. So, but indeed, like a country like the Netherlands, but also for Germany, if you do the calculation on the back of an envelope, the countries are just not big enough. So for something like Holland, you would have something 6 or 7 times the size of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. That's just not possible. So what we're saying is really you need to think about that as well. Not only the income distributional aspects, but the spatial aspects as well. So you need an enormous amount of technological progress, ideas, creative ways of getting solar panels embedded in your windows or embedded in your roofs. Maybe go in, you know, so that the spatial requirements are less. So architects are thinking about that, engineers are thinking about it, but there's a lot to be won on that side. But we haven't even started on that yet. So that's an absolutely crucial point. Thank you for bringing that in.
Thank you. The last question that from the audience, I think we've partly touched upon, and that is the ethical considerations, sort of international justice theme related to climate policy, and the fact that, as our viewer says, poorer countries cannot now grow and industrialize, should we allow them to do so. And of course, if we let them industrialize, isn't then global warming inevitable? So
this is an absolutely crucial question. I'm really happy with that question. It comes at the end, but it's also the most important one at the end. So thank you very much, whoever asked that. So we have a history. Europe, America, my mom comes from Manchester, so the start of the Industrial Revolution. So then we started, you know, using coal to make the Industrial Revolution possible. Coal is very carbon intensive. So you see global warming going up since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's why temperature is measured relative to temperature at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So what you see is that most of the global warming, most of the cumulative emissions and most of the global warming impulses come from the rich countries. They've benefited from it. And then you have very poor countries like India, lesser extent China, but and then we go and say, no, thou shalt not emit. And then they would rightly say, well, bugger you. That's the way you developed. Why are we not allowed to do it? And it's very difficult to, and you might look at emissions per head of the population. Then, of course, they're much higher in developed countries than in India or Africa or China. So this is an absolutely crucial point. So that means that we have a responsibility that the poorest people of the planet need to develop in a way that's green. So, and again, all these summits we have, they don't talk about these issues, but we need to kind of develop technology which can be used in poor countries for them to make the green transition in a way that it's attractive for them and that it doesn't hurt their development process. And it's in our interest that they don't emit so much, but then we have to help them, or maybe even put money on the table and technology on the table for them to take that move. And again, it's absolutely completely similar to the vaccines again, where we're all kind of being triple vaccinated, whereas much of the development world hasn't been vaccinated. That's the big scandal of the vaccine thing. But we want to avoid such a scandal with the green transition as well, because as the person who asked the question said, that if you don't reduce emissions in India or in China, we're just not going to solve global warming. It's good for Holland and the UK to stop global warming, to stop emissions, to go to net zero. But that won't stop global warming on its own. For that, you need those big countries like India and China to be on board as well. So that's the key. It's the key question, and it's not really enough on the agenda. So in Glasgow, of course, the Indians said, "Well, I mean, we need to develop." So I mean, people use coal so that people have cheap electricity and cheap energy, poor people. So if we're not allowed to use it, then what we're going to do? So it's easier to say that for the UK, you can compensate the poor people with some via the tax system, but in developing countries with a much less developed tax system, that's not possible. So that's the big challenge. That's the big elephant in the room let's call it like that. And I'm very glad that somebody brought it up.
Great. Yeah, with that good of a question and that big of a problem, let us end the conversation. Professor, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time and talking to us today.
Thank you for your very interesting questions. I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much.